Being a CIOT or CTA examiner, that's what this episode is all about. From the remit, to your technical knowledge being assessed, the exam writing process, to marking exams, you'll get an insight into the role of being a CIOT examiner from Sam Hart, this episode's guest. You're listening to episode 93 of the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast that helps you and other tax professionals to progress, develop, and improve your careers.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode. This episode brings you probably the most unusual tax role to date in the Tax Role Insight series of the podcast. Started the series to give insights into what different tax roles are like, to help you and other tax professionals to decide what you want to do with your career. We all know about the obvious routes, I'm going to call them, working in an accountancy firm, an in-house, and working our way up in those. But what about the quirky and different roles out there? Like what's being covered in this episode, being a CIOT examiner. And this is all thanks to Sam Hart, who previously was a CIOT examiner doing the inheritance tax paper. The first time I clocked that being an examiner is something that we as tax professionals can do is when I saw an advert in the Tax Advisor magazine. And whilst the advert piqued my interest, it sounded interesting to me. I still didn't apply. Why is that? Whilst I'm technically strong, I don't cover the whole human capital syllabus in my work, and I thought I'd have to brush up in these areas, which would be time consuming, and this put me off. I thought the time input compared to the pay wouldn't be worth it, but at this point I didn't know how much time would be needed or what the pay was. Both of those things were assumptions on my part, and from the discussion with Sam, you get to hear that my concern about the technical knowledge aspect is completely wrong. Sam shares with us what it's like to be a CIOT examiner, what the criteria is to become an examiner, including how you'd be assessed, how the pay works, amongst other things too. I also have a bit of a rant in the episode about the unfair situation where material not included within the study manuals or taught by any of the course providers is examined in an exam. Sam has actually had a large variety of tax roles and tax work that she has done, as you will hear, but she is currently the head of private clients at Claritas Tax, and she still does examine, just not for the CIOT anymore. Rough timings for each section of this episode can be found in the details section of the episode within your podcast player of choice, or by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP93. That link is the link to the show notes for this episode, and the show notes include all the links mentioned throughout this episode. If you want to be a good tax advisor, then you'll need to crack the skill of being able to provide excellent tax advice, the type of advice that clients are happy to pay for and that helps them as much as possible. And doing the CTA qualification definitely helps with this. You'll be decent after doing CTA, but you'll unlikely be excellent. And that makes sense. Qualifications can only do so much because after all, you are assessed in an exam sitting. However, the better you are at providing advice, the more likely that you are to get repeat business from clients, the more likely you are to get referrals, and the easier you'll make your manager's life when it comes to reviewing your work and working with you. You'll become a more valuable member of staff, and as a consequence, you can become more senior and better paid. The list goes on. And this is where the Tax Advice Masterclass comes in. It's designed to teach you how to provide the best tax advice possible. You can get full details of the masterclass by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses. The next one is in February 2024. And feel free to message me with any questions that you have. It'll be great to see you or some people from your team on the Tax Advice Masterclass in February. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. And if you don't mind off then, Sam, just to start us off, could you tell us a little bit about you and your tax career?
Of course. I went to school, finished my A-levels, but although I didn't fail away, I was hasten to point out, I ended up not going to university. I did go, didn't like it, reapplied to go the following year, but in the interim, I got a job at Deloitte from A-levels, and that job was in tax. And previously, I hadn't thought about working in tax, but I was offered the position, and I thought, you know what, I'll give it a try. And the rest is history, as it says. So I worked at Deloitte for 6 years, and I did my ATT and CTA because that was the pathway that they were offering A-level entrance at that time. I then also did my ACA after my CTA, which is definitely the wrong way around to do it. I don't recommend it because you end up having to do more exams. But nevertheless, it meant I did it with 3 qualifications instead of 2, which is always nice. So I worked there for a while, and then I worked for myself for a little bit, doing mostly some practice and then some writing and lecturing because I had children and I just wanted to be a bit more flexible with my time. So I was writing for some books, some business magazines for things like taxation, and that was all really, really good fun. But I was also doing some CPD lecturing. So I went all around the country. I went as far north as Leeds, I think, and over into Wales. But it was good fun. But because I was doing that, I ended up then lecturing at university, which was nice. And I worked at two of the major universities in the West Midlands, at Aston and at Birmingham. And then while I was at Birmingham, I had the opportunity to do a PhD in tax, which sounds a bit odd, but if I start telling people about it, they don't doze off. They actually do tend to find it quite interesting. So yes, I have a doctorate in tax, which is unusual.
Yeah. Well, you obviously just love tax so much.
Sometimes it's a love-hate relationship, but yes, I mean, I do enjoy the technical challenge of it and the fact that it does keep changing, which can be annoying, especially when they rewrite all of the books that I did my CTA in. So all of my tax references have to change. But the fact that it's changing and evolving is actually really interesting, and it makes your life as a practitioner interesting because you're not just doing the same thing over and over again. You're always looking at the new changes and the new nuances and, of course, all the speculations of what's going to come.
Yeah, no, agreed. I've always liked the fact that I suppose it changes every year, at least a little bit of it does. But the part I've realised I don't like so much is how many tax cases there is that come out, because it's just impossible to keep on top of absolutely all of them, even the ones relevant to the area of tax that you work in.
Oh, I agree. As part of my career, I've spent some time working in the National Tax Office of Grant Thornton as well. And so my job was to keep on top of all of these things. And even when that's your job, you could still, I'm still focusing on, private client taxes. It would be impossible to keep on top of everything that's happening in every tax all of the time. It's just so rapidly growing and evolving. But it means that's why people have different specialisms, and, you need to find the right person for the thing that you're looking at.
Yeah, and this is where specialisms and specialisms also almost start coming out, isn't it? Because I work in pretty much purely the recruitment sector at the moment, and that is where I'm super strong. I'm still good at all employment taxes, but there's going to be someone that's better than in the car industry than me, for example, or catering or retail, because I don't often work in those sectors.
Oh, absolutely. And in various points in my career, people have specialized in just doing doctors or just doing solicitors, and you see people who specialize in sports people. These are all people doing private client tax. They are, as you say, narrow focusing on that specific area because, it's back down to experience, isn't it? The more you've done it, the more you'll see, and the more times you'll be able to go, oh, I've seen that before. Which, I think works.
I didn't realise you worked in the national office at GT. So was that like a policy role, was it, where you're helping keep everyone up to date internally?
Yeah, there was a small team, and yes, our job was to basically keep the firm updated on tax cases, developments in tax. We responded to consultations. We updated all the databases within the firms in terms of like tax ideas and tax planning things, and got involved in, doing the budget. I mean, those days they used to do a separate budget website every budget. And so I'd go to work at 9 o'clock in the morning knowing that I wouldn't go to bed until 5 in the morning. Actually, I find it very exciting.
Fair enough. Yeah. Do those type of roles still exist? Because obviously now you've got like Kroner and Tollies that they have like their own newsletters and similar news updates things that do very much that role, I suppose.
I mean,
Do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. I don't know specifically because I don't work there anymore. I know the bigger firms do still tend to have some kind of national tax dysfunction, but whether that, the day-to-day role of that has changed from when I did it, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Because I always think it sounds like quite an interesting role, particularly for people who like the technical side of tax.
Absolutely. I think the thing with tax is it attracts a lot of people who really are just there for the technical stuff. And sometimes that's all people want to do is just sit in a room and read the legislation. And a job like that is great for doing that kind of stuff because you can really get down into the nitty gritty of it. I mean, one year we annotated the Finance Act. So we had to read all of Hansard and, make comments against all the new sections in the Finance Act that was published. So that was good fun, but very time consuming.
Yeah, I can imagine. And so right now, then, this is all, I suppose, brought you to where you are now, which is to a tax partner at Claritas Tax in private clients.
Yes, absolutely. I head up the private client team for the whole country. Claritas has expanded rapidly over the past few years. We've now got 5 offices. We've got Birmingham, Manchester, Nottingham, Bristol and Glasgow. So I cover all of those offices, although my home office is in Birmingham because, as we both know, Jack, Birmingham is the best place to be.
Although I work from home pretty much all the time, so I end up being just on the outskirts of Birmingham most of the time nowadays. So do you still do any of these like extra little things like you did at some point when you were doing like the writing and this and because I think you work 4 days, if I'm not wrong?
I do work 4 days a week. And yes, while I was working for myself, one of the things that I did was I got into writing, and I still do a bit of writing. I write a CGT book for Bloomsbury, but also examining. So the first examining job I had was for the CIOT, and I was examining on the specialist inheritance tax and trust paper. And yeah, that was a really good experience. Although, I'll talk you through some of the ups and downs of it. But yes, I still enjoy doing that kind of thing. I don't examine for the CIOT anymore, but I do still examine, and I find it very interesting because you get to, dream up these wonderful scenarios in your head. Sometimes they're inspired by time, sometimes they're not, and get to get into the nitty gritty of how that is dealt with for tax purposes.
Yeah. You're the first person I've spoke to though that I know is an examiner because obviously they don't publicise, do they, who they are for obvious reasons, right? To avoid cheating and similar things. So in a way it feels like I'm talking to like a spy, I suppose, a bit with this. So like how did the opportunity arise for you to examine for this IoT and I suppose STEP?
Yes, well, when I did it, they actually were advertising for examiners, and I think they do still periodically advertise for them, recruit for them. And I did also know a couple of people who worked at the CIOT or who were on the technical committees that the CIOT have. And I did also know a couple of people on the education committee, or rather, I kind of got to know them more as part of the process. But yeah, it was an open process. I mean, obviously, once you are in the team, then they don't publicise that. And I have had the situation just a couple of years ago where I was marking something and the candidate was citing some articles that I'd written in it, which I thought was quite amusing.
Extra marks?
But of course not.
Hopefully they passed. So do you remember where they're advertised? Because I've seen stuff in the Tax Advisor magazine, I think, for the CIOT. So was that where you saw it, can you remember, or was it somewhere different?
Yes, it probably was, or it may have been on the website, because at the time I was working in the National Tax Office, so I was on the CIT website a lot, looking at, what consultations responses they were doing and things like that. It may just have been advertised on the website as well. Obviously now everything's more digital, and there's that weekly newsletter that comes out that it probably would be included in as well. But I think even on social media, the CIT have a presence now, so I know they advertise other jobs on LinkedIn, so perhaps they also advertise it on there. I mean, I think ideally they prefer it to be people that they know, people who are already doing it, who can say, "Oh, I know somebody who'd like to get involved." But yeah, they if they need people, they'll ask for them.
Yeah. And how did it work then? Is it like technically an employed role or is it a self-employed role when you're an examiner?
It's self-employed because you don't get paid a salary. You get paid, certainly for the CIOT, there's like, or there certainly was when I did it. It may have changed. There was an annual meeting, like a whole day, where all of the examiners went to, and you talk about things in general, and then you talk in your teams for your paper and discuss what you do. So you'd get paid a fee for attending that day, and then you'd also get paid for the exams that you're marking, really.
Yeah. So I didn't realise there were actual teams then for like specific papers. So it's not just when you were doing the inheritance tax paper, then it wasn't just you. There was multiple people working on that exam at once. Is that in every aspect of the exam then, in terms of writing the questions, checking them, marking? Do you all kind of share the burden of that? Like I suppose the better question is, what is everyone's responsibility in that? Is it all the same? Do you have it cut up? How does that all kind of work?
Yeah, so when I was there, let's say there were 4 people in the team. So we'd all sit there and we'd discuss which areas we wanted to cover on the paper. We'd look at what had been covered in previous years, because obviously we need to make sure we cover the whole syllabus and we don't just always focus on the same one every single time. This is not a tip to say if it's been on last year, it won't be on this year. But yeah, so we decide which areas we wanted to cover. And then obviously we discuss who had, going back to our narrow specialisms, who had the most experience in those particular areas that we were talking about. And you often then worked in pairs. So maybe say there were 4 questions on the exam. 2 of you would deal with 2 questions, 2 of you would deal with the other 2 questions. And then one of you might write 1 question and then the other person would review it and make amendments, and vice versa for the other question. And all exam questions had to be signed off by the chief examiner before they actually made it onto a CIOT exam paper.
Yeah. I'm supposing by the time it gets to the chief examiner, they can't really do super thorough checks for all the exams, I'm guessing, because they're probably not a specialist in every area of tax, unless they're some kind of wizard. So I'm presuming by the time it gets them, really, it's almost guaranteed to be technically correct.
Well, yes. I mean, the people in the group are technically strong. To be able to be accepted as an examiner, you have to submit evidence of your technical capabilities, and that gets reviewed and tested, if you like, to make sure that you can do what you say you can. Like there's no way I would have gotten on being a VAT examiner, for example. And by the time it gets to the final examiner, not only has a specialist written it and another specialist checked it, the other people in the group will also have seen it. So it should have been seen by 4 specialist technical eyes before it goes to the chief exam. But the point is, of course, that the CIOT answers are published. So it had better be right.
Yeah. I think I know of at least one time where there's been something wrong in a question, I think, but I've only heard of that one time, and it wasn't the inheritance tax paper, so no, it definitely wasn't what you were doing. But yeah, it can still happen, I suppose, can't it? But I have seen more frequently some really badly written questions, I would say, where it's not using the same terminology that's in, say, the study manuals. It's not the same terminology that's being used by any of the lecturers. So then it almost throws people off in the exam, I think. But I suppose that just happens sometimes, doesn't it? And it must be a small chance of that happening, because I've, again, not seen that very often, but I have seen it a few times.
And again, if you were involved in teaching people, it would probably be a bit of a conflict of interest to also be writing the exam paper. So there's probably a little bit of a disconnect sometimes in terms of terminology or how things are taught. I don't think there's ever any intention to try and catch people out, but sometimes, yes, when you're trying to write a complicated question to test as many areas as possible within your 20 or 25 marks, whichever it is. And yes, sometimes I suppose there may be issues there.
Yeah, yeah. And again, this isn't actually related to examiners, but there are definitely some things that are asked on some exam questions that aren't actually in the study manuals. And, well, maybe they should be in the study manuals, but either way, I think I've always found it quite unfair when that happens, because obviously most students, they'll go to Kaplan or Tolles or one of the other training providers, they'll be taught, they'll have the study manual, and that's almost sold to them as this is everything that you need to know. But then there's cases where you need to know more. And obviously a well-prepared student would probably still pass anyway, but those that are on the cusp could lose out for that. I've always thought that's a little bit unfair. So I do wonder whether they can improve their process somewhat on that, because it would probably stop the complaints that happen when that does happen sometimes, because I'm presuming when those things happen, people complain and aren't happy about it, particularly the ones who end up failing with by 1 mark or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, as I've said, the examiners will work from the syllabus, not necessarily from the study manuals. So if something has been missed from the study providers, that's not necessarily going to be known about at the time when you're writing the exam.
Yeah. So I can say how it happens. If you want to be able to provide amazing tax advice, impressing your peers and colleagues, then I suggest you take a look at the Tax Advice Masterclass. There's real examples from the work that I've done over the years, where I show you what's good and what's bad about it. I also show you what the hallmarks of high quality tax advice are, so that you can make sure that these are present in your advice, and I'll show you much more. Head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses for details and for how to enrol. The next Tax Advice Masterclass is in February 2024, and hopefully I can see you or some of your colleagues there. So how come then you decided to go and be an examiner then? How come you decided to accept it? You've obviously done it twice, so you must like it, but before you did it, what kind of motivated you to go and do it?
Well, as I said at the time, I had children, small children, so I wanted something that was flexible and part-time that I could do. I mean, not completely at my leisure. Obviously, for the CIT, there's a fixed day that you need to attend, and obviously you need to mark the papers relatively quickly once they've set the exams. But, there's still some flexibility around it. And it was a way to, still use my brain and still, keep on that technical edge rather than my brain turning to Teletubbies.
Yeah. And it sounds like you enjoy the technical side of tax anyway, so
I do. I confess tax geek, but, some of us have got to be, haven't we?
we have. And we can't have a profession full of people that don't love tax. This wouldn't work. So we've covered a lot of what being an examiner involves, particularly for this AOT, but is there anything that we haven't talked about that's, I suppose, included in the whole process and what happens, what you're expected to do, and so on?
I mean, there is obviously some training given to you, but having examined for the CIOT, I've obviously done examinations at university, both at undergraduate and at postgraduate level, and now I examine for STEM. The best training is really just doing it. As you start, it will be a slow process, but the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. And I think the better questions you'll produce and the faster you'll be able to mark them, because you understand how to get the best out of the candidate and allow them to show you their knowledge. And, again, this is a bit geeky, but I'll say it anyway. When I get a great exam response to mark, it's a thing of beauty.
Yeah, I suppose even more impressive as well when they do it in the time constraints that you have in an exam.
Yes, I mean, I because I'm quite old, when I did my CTA, you had to pass all of them at the same time, and it was all by paper. So yeah, things have changed, but yeah, it is still quite artificial, because in real life, while you might have pressured deadlines, it's never going to be quite as pressured as produce this exam on the spot, to produce this advice on the spot in an exam.
Yeah. On that note, actually, because I've thought about this a few times, is there a better way that we can examine people? Because as you say, it's not a simulation of real life how it currently works, right? And like, there's very few things that I wouldn't check at work. I'd pretty much check everything. And there's some things I don't know the answer for off the top of my head. And that's not because I'm a bad tax advisor. It's just because I can't remember everything. So I've thought, like, could it be better to have people say a hall for a full day and they have the full day, and as long as they don't leave it, as long as they answer the questions, it's fine. Do you think there's anything that could be better to help better assess people?
Well, different professional bodies do things in different ways. The ACA do a case study, which when I did, it was a half a day long, but afterwards it became an all day thing, and you got some of the information in advance so you could prepare to try and make it more like, an actual real life situation where you would get some information from the client, and then maybe you'd have a meeting and you talk and get some more information. I think the problem with that, it is very difficult to concentrate under exam pressures for a whole day. So whether that is a better way of doing it or not, I don't know. At the moment, I've said I examine for STEP, and I actually examine on the essay route, where you can produce essays rather than they do exams as well, but you can do essays as an alternative route to doing the time pressured exams. Now, that does mean that obviously the answers are expected to be far more in depth and to show research around the subject, but that can be is an alternative way of trying to get to that knowledge and ensuring that the people undertaking that professional exam have got the required knowledge and experience to do it.
Yeah. So they actually get the choice as to whether to do an exam or a case study. Is that for every single kind of bit of it?
Yeah, there are a number of different ways to becoming STEP qualified. When I did it, there were only two routes. One was to do a set of 4 exams. The alternative was you could, if you've been doing it for a long time, become qualified by experience. Now, STEP have a range of different exams, so you can mix and match the ones that are most relevant to your personal circumstances. Because a lot of people doing STEP private client tax advisors, but a lot of them are lawyers, so it might be a slightly different perspective that they're coming from. So you can pick the exams and do it that way, or as I say, you can do 3 essays, in-depth essays on there's a list of essay topics published every year, and you have to answer what they're asking in that question in a
Yeah.
detailed, well-researched way.
Yeah. Well, what do you think you would do if you could go back now? Sam, would you do the exams or would you do the case studies?
Instead, I actually would still do the exams because I found particularly the exams on trusts and estates and the law and the mechanics behind it, I have found that invaluable in my tax advice practice.
Hmm.
Well, I would still do the exam route personally.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, it's interesting knowing that they've got those different routes, I suppose, because some people are just not good at exams. I've heard stories about like some real senior tax professionals, like director partner level, struggling to pass CTA exams, but obviously they're good at their job because they
Yeah.
wouldn't have got to that level, and they're clearly technically competent because they wouldn't have got to that level if they weren't. So that's, I suppose, what's somewhat spurred my thoughts around whether the CIOT exams in particular could be done in a slightly different way to, I suppose, assess students better and not just exclude people because they're not good at sitting an exam, which does happen sometimes. When it comes to like marking the exams, and how many do you usually have to mark?
Well, it depends which professional body you're going for and which paper it is. Obviously, when I was doing a CTA, Inheritance Tax Trust was a specialist paper, so there weren't as many candidates as some of the main papers, and they've all changed again since then anyway. But it's just however many people do it. For CTA, obviously it's large amounts of money. If you enter examining for ACA, it will be hundreds and hundreds of people. It can vary depending on how many people decide to do it in that. And so it can be difficult to manage in terms of time. For example, if you've budgeted for marking, say 100 essays and you end up with 200, obviously that's double the amount of time that you have to spend doing it, but you quite often don't have double the time in which to do it because obviously there are strict deadlines for when things have to be back. And because most things, certainly for CIOT, everything had to be double marked anyway, you've got to get it through 2 people within the time frame before getting the exams to the candidate.
Yeah. And do both of those people get paid then to mark it?
When I did it, it was related to how many questions you looked at, so you got paid. The pay rate was per exam, and then if you were marking half of that exam, you'd get paid half of the rate. So,
Well, that might make more sense actually, because if you're saying that you, particularly when you were there anyway, you were split into 2 teams, or I know that was an example, but let's say that that's the case, then you really want to mark the one that you've written and reviewed rather than the other 2, I suppose, because that might be an area that you're not as familiar with, or
exactly.
exactly. Yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it? Actually, yeah.
I think as well, it's fine if the candidate is good and they've followed the mark scheme relatively closely, but if they've done something dramatically wrong, that doesn't mean that they don't get the rest of the marks. But if they've gone off on one and that's not your area, it could be quite hard to follow it through if you didn't fully get.
Well, and time consuming potentially, because I thought about kind of, I suppose, put my name forward when I saw the CIOT advertising for examiners, but I just thought, I do not know the full syllabus well enough to mark things quickly. There's got to be some questions or some areas that I don't practice daily or might not have even practiced at all in real life. And I just thought I will not be able to mark that question well in I suppose, a reasonable time period. So that kind of put me off a bit. But hearing actually that you don't necessarily have to mark every question, that's actually quite a positive thing, I would say. And it would make me reconsider actually.
Well, I mean, as I say, I haven't done a CIOT for a few years now. But the education committee are very approachable, and if you had these kind of questions, I'm sure if you asked them, they'd be able to answer them for you, or direct you to somebody who would be able to answer.
Yeah. So that's the education committee. Is that who tends to deal with all the exams then, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. So I suppose anyone that's interested anyway and just wants to reach out on a whim, that's probably a good place for them to go, is to reach out to the education committee.
Yes, and they may not be looking at the moment, and if they're not, then that's fine. What I would recommend at that point is that perhaps you do get involved in some of the technical committees in the areas that you think you might like to examine. So there are ones covering OMB, covering employment taxes, covering private clients. So if that's something that you're interested in, then maybe see if you can get involved with that, and you'll get to keep really up to date with the latest things that are happening, perhaps even before they're out in the public eye.
Yeah.
And then you're in the best place, if you do want to take on that role, you're already involved and you're there on stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a member of the employment tax committee, actually, the CIOT, and I can vouch for the getting the information early, because even when HMRC are just thinking about making a change, you tend to hear about it. It might get scrapped, but it might go forward, and then you've almost had like 12 or 6 months extra than everyone else to know about it. So then by the time it is announced, you can already talk about it with quite a lot of knowledge and depth on it, which I find quite helpful.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Some of the people at Claritas are involved in various technical committees, and yeah, it is useful.
Yeah, I think even good from a BD perspective as well, because you can start getting ready to talk to clients about it. So then literally the day it's announced, you can
Yes.
talk, yeah, you can go out there and market or advertise or speak to your contacts, whatever it is that you like to do for BD, you can do all those things with it.
Yeah.
So what did you like then about, I suppose, I know you're still doing it for STEP, and they sound broadly similar, although I'm sure, I know there's got to be some differences, but what is it that you like about being an examiner then, and what don't you like, if there is anything that falls in that latter category?
What I like about it is, as I say, being able to use my brain and use my technical knowledge. Certainly for STEP, I can be a little bit more creative in a question and come up with topics that amuse me. And as I say, it's a good way of, it makes you sometimes look at your client situation and think, oh, if this was different and if that was different, that make a really good exam question. So it does keep you on your toes and makes you think of everything, as you're providing advice to clients, even in the real world. I think the downsides are obviously there are some time pressures, and you do have to stick to some very strict deadlines. And I was once marking at university, and I had my tonsils out, but I didn't get any time off because I had to mark these exams by the time they had to be back. So you don't need to be wary of that. And I think you've alluded to the point earlier that you need to make sure it's worth it from your time perspective. As I say, CIT, when I did it, certainly they paid you for attendance into a meeting, and then you got paid per paper, but you need to work out whether that comes out at a reasonable rate for your time, really. And if it doesn't, then perhaps you do something more lucrative.
Yeah.
So it swings and roundabouts. I would recommend doing it. I would do it again. It was a good experience. I got to learn more about the CIT, which is, a really important organisation in the tax world. And it's good to put on your CV that you used to examine for the CIMT.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely is. Well, it's particularly from the technical standpoint, and I think, as you say, like the fact that you get to create those exam questions, you get to see your real life scenarios with clients, and then think, how can you tweak it to make a good exam question? You're like technically complete and thorough, like all the time. So it must help in that everyday advice at work as well.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm guessing you're thinking it makes you a better advisor than what you would be if you hadn't ever have done it.
I would say so. I mean, as I say, you have to be up to date on everything, because you can't rely on, I did my CTA in 1998 because I'm really, really old. I can't rely on the knowledge that's 25 years old in writing exam questions. So it doesn't make you be up to date. And as I say, yes, it does make you think about the alternatives and what about this and what about that, which can only help you as a client advisor.
Yeah. So for people who have listened to this, might have already been interested or become interested from listening to this chat, like what advice would you give to them? What would you say to them?
I would say if you think you'd like to do it, then you probably would be good at it, because the best people to do things are people who are enthusiastic about doing things. You do need to be technically strong. You do need to be up to date on things that are happening. So if you don't already, read these updates and these things that come out from iCrone or LexisNexis, then do. But don't just skim read them and think, because you may need to understand what the point of them are. There's no point going, oh, there was a tax case about domicile, if you don't understand the point that was made in it, because then you won't understand how that affects the advice that you would give, and obviously then therefore the questions that you would need to ask to pull that out in an exam question. So and that would be my advice. And as I said, to keep up to date, keep involved with the CINT as far as possible, and join technical committees and just be part of the wider tax community.
Yeah. So basically do loads of things that help your technical knowledge or help. And then I suppose reach out to them if you're interested in doing it. They must still be looking for people. I don't know what papers they're looking for it for, but as I say, I've seen the examiner stuff quite a few times fairly recently. So they must be struggling to get people. I wonder what the reason is for that as well, whether it's just time or people not being interested or people not being technically good enough because, well, you need a very high level of technical competence from what you're saying, and I would have thought that anyway, I suppose, before we spoke. Actually, on that point though, Sam, I did think about this earlier. I forgot to ask it, but you said they essentially, I don't think you used this word, but essentially test your technical knowledge, make sure it's good enough. Can you remember how they did it for you for the CIOT, and is it any different for STEP? How do they check, I suppose, make sure that you are technically strong enough?
I mean, this idea is slightly different in that once you are accepted as an examiner, then you go to the examiner's day and everything. So I had to submit anonymized copies of technical advice I'd given to clients and they explain what I'd done and why and that kind of thing. And I don't know, but I assume that was then reviewed by the chief examiner and the rest of the team that I was joining to make sure that they were happy with, not only with the advice, but the reasoning behind it.
Yeah.
I think if you were on a team and you weren't technically able enough, I think that would be relatively obvious relatively quickly. Thought process. So with STEP, it's more informal. And if I sent them exam questions that were rubbish, they wouldn't use them.
Yeah. So if people do want to get in touch with you anyway, Sam, or, learn more about you, where are the best places for them to go?
Well, I'm obviously on the Claritas website and claritastax.co.uk, and my email address is sam.hart@claritastax.co.uk. I'm also on LinkedIn and around, so yeah, come and say hello.
All links mentioned throughout the episode are included in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP93. There are links to the Tax Advice Masterclass, Sam's LinkedIn, and also her email address. If you enjoyed this episode, then to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, you can head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe to sign up for email notifications. Episodes are bi-weekly and released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop, and improve your career. Until next time.